Chapter 10. Glass. It was unsettling to find myself back at Radestad, the same hospital I was taken to immediately after my stroke and where I had my thrombectomy. The delays didn't help my uneasiness. A seemingly endless amount of paperwork needed to be completed before they moved me to a room. I wonder if I might have been examined more promptly if I arrived in an ambulance instead of a taxi. The nurse who had accompanied me from Clemendal held my hand as I waited. I cried and I tried to say husband to her. She squeezed my hand tightly and nodded to let me know she understood. "He'll be here soon," she said in a soft voice. During the wait, my right eye regained its sight for 5 minutes, but then the gray curtain returned. Remco blanched when he finally arrived with our son Martin soon afterward. He was experiencing a frightening replay as he saw me lying there helplessly without a neurologist in sight. Another 30 minutes passed before the emergency room neurologist came to see me. This young woman immediately reminded me of the doctor that had kept me waiting for 5.5 hours while a clot wreaked havoc on my brain and killed an endless number of neurons. Remco stood nearby, telling her the essential information about my previous stroke and thrombectomy. His voice was agitated since he could see that the same situation was unfolding again. He had driven 40 kilometers to meet me at the hospital and had beaten the doctor to my bedside by 15 minutes, when she was only down the hall. Remco knew from experience what could happen with that sort of long delay. "You should scan her immediately," he demanded. The doctor's body language indicated that she was annoyed at him for being insistent or offering an opinion. As she finished examining me, it was almost as if she slowed down while writing her instructions for an echo and visit to the hospital eye doctor, saying, "Someone will take you there." She didn't seem to be in any hurry whatsoever. Minutes ticked away, at least another quarter of an hour, as Remco regularly returned to the nurse's station to ask why it was taking so long. When the doctor returned, she made it clear that there was no one available to take me to the scan. She suggested that she walk us out of the emergency room and Remco could bring me back to the main hospital himself for the scan. As Remco turned my wheelchair around a tight corner, he accidentally hit the doctor's ankle with the chair. To her, "Ouch." He replied, "We're in an emergency room, so don't worry. You can get treated right away." She gave him an icy, deadly look. As all of the unpleasantness with the doctor unfolded, my right eye continued to open and close that shadowy curtain, sometimes with crystal clear vision, then totally blind, then back to partial vision. Hours passed like that as we waited to be seen for an echo. My face and throat were scanned. I was told that there was no visible blood clot, so we were instructed to proceed to the eye clinic next. We entered the waiting room in the eye clinic and could see that it was filled with patients, most of them over 70 years old. I was exhausted and beginning to grow impatient with how long everything was taking and how many departments we were sent to. Remco and Martin seemed worried as well. When Remco tried to convince the receptionist that it was an urgent case, she rather brusquely said, "Sit down, Mr. De Vries. The doctor made no notes about anything urgent regarding your appointment." We waited another hour and a half as more old people came and went to their appointments. When we were finally called in to the eye doctor's assistant, she asked a range of questions before the doctor arrived. He was a middle-aged man, and we were told that Remco would need to answer for me if it wasn't a simple yes or no response. As the doctor began a more thorough look at my eye, he turned to Remco and asked, "Why didn't you get an MRI?" "I don't know," my husband replied, looking somewhat startled. Suddenly, the doctor was in a hurry, signing papers and handing them to my husband with brisk instruction. "Go to the stroke unit right away." Remco hastily rolled my wheelchair to the stroke unit where they took a scan and injected blood thinners immediately. But by that time, my right eye had lost all vision. They assigned me to a hospital bed in the stroke unit, and I waited. My sight never returned. Later that day, Remco was asked to talk to the supervisor of the ER doctor that helped me that morning. The supervisor told him that the young doctor felt threatened by his remarks, and Remco said that he understood. But he also explained his side of the story. The bottom line was that he couldn't really have cared less about what she thought or felt, when he had been right all along. The outcome was precisely what he had feared. Remco and I were in complete agreement. We were both fed up with Rin State, just as we had been fed up with Slingeland Hospital months prior. When I had a chance to see my medical record at a later date, there was more written up about my husband's perceived threat to the neurologist that day than the serious implications of my medical condition. Lying in the hospital bed gave me time to think and ask myself some questions. What's wrong with me? Why have I had 2 strokes within a couple of months? I already had blood thinners after my first stroke. What's next? A 3rd stroke? I felt hopelessness seeping into me. I really wanted to leave, to get out of there. In all honesty, I did not feel safe in that or any other hospital just then. Remco and our 2 oldest children were there, and I could hear them out in the hall talking to a nurse. That was my chance. I could make my move. It took me at least 5 minutes to get the railing of my bed down so I could put my feet on the ground. Next, I managed to get my slippers on. Then I unhooked myself from the IV, taking my 3-legged cane. I made sure to use the sides of the wall, anything that appeared, for support. I wiggled away slowly. The most important thing was to keep my drop foot in place. I did that by turning the foot outward. I'm getting out of here, I thought. The annoying old man sitting in the bed next to me sneered. You can't do that. I just looked at him and thought, yes, I can. It took me 3 minutes to walk the 3 meters to the door. I was pretty happy that I managed to calculate that. I'm on the run now. I was slowly heading for the end of the hallway at 1 meter per minute. I bumped into the right wall several times because I was not accustomed to being blind on the right side. But I also needed the wall for support. Where was I going? It didn't matter. I just felt like leaving. I went without stopping. The left side of my back hurt enormously. Doctors and nurses walked by. When someone looked at me, I immediately looked away and toward the wall. I felt liberated walking on my own. No one knew where I was. 1 eye. That's not too bad. My inner voice was chatting away as I tried to build my confidence. I was about 2 meters from the elevator when I heard a voice behind me. Here she is. Shoot, they found me. My first escape attempt had lasted for a staggering 20 meters. Mom? Mom? It was Martin calling me. The nurses are looking for you. I mumbled a response, something intended to sound like home. Remco had a concerned face as he caught up with us. I will do my best to get you back to Klimendal as soon as possible, he promised. You don't want to be here right now. I understand. Sit down in the wheelchair, please, and let's go for a meal in the cafeteria. Our trip to the cafeteria did not help, and the day continued to be anxiety-inducing. The losing sight in one of my eyes forever, and the fear that this kind of thing could happen again at any given moment were both depressing thoughts. When I returned to the hospital room, Remco had somehow convinced one of the doctors to come down to talk to us. The doctor listened carefully as he explained that I did not want to stay in the hospital. She understood. She countered that it was risky to let me go with so many blood thinners in my body. She asked me, "Do you still want to leave?" I gave her a sharp look and sarcastically replied, "Toodaloo," slang for goodbye in Dutch. Martin and Al couldn't keep themselves from laughing a little. But I did not end up leaving that night because Remco and the children convinced me to stay. It turned out to be a long night. I couldn't unwind and rest, and I asked the nurse for a sleeping pill, something I wouldn't usually request. Unfortunately, the medication never took effect, and I remained awake for most of the night as my back hurt more than ever. That type of pain is what they call neuropathic pain, and doing something to get rid of it entirely, sooner rather than later, seemed unavoidable. A few days later, Mr. and Mrs. Professor came to see me. This is how we referred to my sister Ingela and her husband Gunnar, one of our family's inside jokes. They are, in fact, professors. My sister is a professor in caring science at Sofia Med Högskola in Stockholm. Her husband is an MD and a professor chair in clinic cancer epidemiology at Gothenburg University. Remco was exhausted and happy to have them present because he knew he could use some help and additional insight. He knew that the doctors had kept me waiting too long the first 2 times. Unnecessary delays that had devastating results. Remco also believed that I would not survive a 3rd stroke. "Look," Gunnar said in a calm voice. "We will have to get Linda's medical file first. Then I will find out through my contacts at Sahlgrenska Academy Hospital who the best neurologist in the Netherlands is. We will take Linda to him. Period." Immediately I could see the relief on Remco's face. It was as if Gunnar had taken a massive weight off his shoulders. Gunnar received a response from his colleague in Sweden the next morning. His name is Frank Erik Deleu, and he is a neurologist and professor at Radboud University's Nijmegen Medical Center. "How far away is that?" Gunnar asked. He was unaware that 90% of the Netherlands could be reached within an hour from where we were sitting. "It's just 20 to 30 minutes away," Remco replied. Gunnar continued. "I'll write him an email first. If we get no response, we'll go and visit him. We should, however, make sure we have Linda's file from Rinstate before we go." My sister Ingela took care of me that day and accompanied me on several appointments with Herma, Joy, and Marlin. Marlin was a psychologist I had grown to like and trust. I felt that she was on my side and she made arrangements to help me cope with the pain. One of the methods she used was EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, an integrative psychotherapy most commonly employed in the treatment of traumas. If my therapist measured my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, a level of 3 was uncomfortable but bearable, and a continuous pain at 7 or above was too intense to cope with. My pain level was usually around 7 at the time, and using EMDR brought it back to a 4 or 5. However, at night, the pain always came back. When I was eventually able to say some words, I tried to convince her that I needed some additional changes made with my occupational and physical therapists. Basically, I wanted to change Daphne, my speech therapist, and have the opportunity to see more of my favorite therapists. Herma, Lisette, and Jerome were my favorites. I only saw Lisette a few times, but I immediately noticed that she was very competent and had a lot of experience. I met Jerome, my physiotherapist, a few times during the hand electrical stimulation. During those sessions, he observed how little my pinky finger moved. Electrical stimulation pads were taped onto my arm, and a small device sent electrical waves through my nerves in the hopes of activating the connections between my brain and my arm again. Much later, after I had left Clemendal as an intern, I wrote a note to Jerome. Something along the lines of, "Do you want to be my therapist at home when I leave Clemendal?" Unfortunately, he replied, "I can't do that. Clemendal doesn't allow me to see patients outside of the clinic." That disappointed me. Of the dozens of therapists I had seen, I would have preferred to only work with Herma, Lisette, Jerome, Marlin, and Femke, a brilliant speech therapist I connected with later in my recovery period. My reasons for choosing that specific group of people were related to the coffee lady I observed in the hospital right after my stroke. No matter the therapist, I always took time to observe them carefully. My favorite therapists were all smart, no-nonsense people. They treated me like an intelligent human being that fully understood what they said. Last but not least, they were all kind. In my mind, a kind person is someone who lives in a more awakened state of mind, making the right ethical choices from within his or her heart. A kind person carries consciousness within that has a continuous concern for fellow human beings. In a book I read some 10 years earlier, The Art of Being Kind by Stefan Einhorn, the author proposes that only 20% of the population possesses the type of kindness I just described. The remaining 80% do not. Looking at the world around us, that makes sense. My sister Ingela took care of me. She wondered out loud one day, "Why are you wearing jogging pants all the time?" Soon after, she returned with some lightweight pants, a t-shirt, and a pair of easy-to-put-on Velcro sandals since she took me outdoors. One day, she brought a ball I could put my left hand on and around. That was rather difficult for me since my spasticity seemed to be getting worse every day. The spasms made it difficult to keep my fingers open, and my left hand was cramping almost continuously. I couldn't set my fingers down on the ball without first prying them open with my right hand. Trying to force my left hand open with my right hand took several minutes due to the ongoing spasms. It was time to get more language back. "Focus on the Swedish words," Ingela said, so I did. We took opportunities throughout the day to work in time to practice. Once, we were having lunch with the whole family. The Ronald McDonald House above the clinic provided a perfect family-like environment and got us away from the hospital atmosphere. We had just ordered sushi when Gunnar held up his glass and asked me, "What is this?" I sat there, thinking hard, trying to come up with an answer to a simple question. I concentrated more and more, but I still couldn't come up with the right word. I had failed once again. I hated feeling stupid. A strong sense of determination took hold of me in that moment. I needed to remember that a glass was called glass. 2 days later, I was checked out of Klimendal for a weekend at home with the family. We went to a restaurant for dinner, and Remco's sister Carmen also came along. I made sure to catch Gunnar's eye, pointed at my glass, and casually said, "Glass." He smiled back at me, and I felt enormously proud. Gunnar didn't know that I had been practicing for hours and hours on the word glass for the previous 2.5 days. Chapter 11. C9H17NO2. I looked to my left and right, making sure no one would see me. After entering the railway station, I found a suitable place right at the start of the platform. From this position, the train would still have enough speed. I rolled my wheelchair closer to the edge of the platform until I found the perfect spot. Now I would be able to make it onto the track. The blue and yellow train approached the station. I needed to be patient because my timing had to be perfect. As I started counting down in silence, it seemed like an eternity before the train reached the platform. 10, 9, 8, 7. The train passed the last railroad switch routing it to the platform I was on. 6, 5, 4. I continued counting as I thought, "This is it. 3, 2, 1. I stopped thinking and I just pushed my wheelchair forward. Immediately, a massive flash of pain went through my back. I opened my eyes. The unbearable pain had woken me. Damn, it was only a dream. I silently wished I hadn't been dreaming. I wish I was dead. Lying beside me, Remco rubbed his eyes. The shock that had gone through my body as it was waking me up had woken him up too. "I won't die," I said, or I thought I said. He just looked at me. "What did you say?" he asked.
"Pain," I said. "I want die." I was crying in agony when I told him that. My pride had never before allowed me to have these types of thoughts. Now I did. Remco just held me. Poor Remco. My stroke had turned our lives upside down, and now he had to deal with a wife with suicidal thoughts as well. "You promise me, help me do end my pain?" I asked him. I needed his help in case my life became unbearable. Remco responded vaguely with some words that sounded reassuring. I felt so sorry for him. Clemendal had sent me home on Friday. From that point on, I was expected to be at the clinic on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday to receive therapy. Of course, my whole family was happy to have me home, but I felt guilty since I was now an extra burden on them. From the beginning, Remco helped me get dressed in the morning because, if he didn't, it took an hour to accomplish. Then he prepared breakfast. Madeline and Elle massaged my aching body at night, and Martin drove me the 30 kilometers to Clemendal 4 days a week and waited around until I was finished with my therapy. I felt like a burden to them. About a month after the stroke, I began to notice the neuropathic pains. In the beginning, they were annoying, ranging from pain levels 3 to 5. Living with that amount of pain was manageable and wouldn't prevent me from doing rehab. Millions of people live with some form of pain every day, so I didn't complain initially for that reason. However, the pain continued to escalate and reached a level where it began to interfere with my rehabilitation. A terrible burning sensation in my back, with pain levels of 7 and up to 9 at night, completely wore me out. It was impossible to fall asleep when my back felt like it was being barbecued, and sleepless nights were the consequence. The pain wore me out to the point where I was no longer able to take in new material in my therapy sessions. A person's body needs sleep to remember and save newly acquired skills. My sleeplessness was preventing me from doing this. Given the recovery time frame that had been set, 3 to 6 months, I began to worry even more about all the time I was wasting. Dealing with unbearable pain was probably the most challenging part of my whole recovery process. We tried warming cushions, cold baths, warm baths, wet towels, tapping on the painful spots, and even squeezing my neck. But none of those things eased the pain, and sleeping pills did not help me fall asleep. Those pills could not extinguish the barbecue-like sensation in my back and left me feeling foggy the next morning. A few weeks before, while still at the clinic, Remco and I had discussed the severity of the pain. I hesitantly asked the doctor to prescribe me something to deal with it. As naive as I was at the time, I thought there would be some Advil-type medication I could take to make the pain disappear. The doctor told me there was no Advil to take for neuropathic pain. There were 2 options, but neither of them would work immediately. The doctor decided to give me gabapentin, C9H17NO2. Gabapentin is a medicine that was initially developed to treat epilepsy. It affects the brain by preventing brain cells from firing too rapidly, thus preventing an epileptic seizure. Often triggered by stress or sleep deprivation, an epileptic seizure is a state where brain cells fire too quickly and the body loses control and/or consciousness. Neuropathic pain is also a process by which brain cells that deliver pain signals spin out of control by firing rapidly. The doctor explained that it could take up to 1 month for the gabapentin to have any effect, so until then, I was not to expect any pain relief. The following 2 months were a blur, filled with confusion, tormenting pain, and a general lack of sleep. The medication did very little to lessen the pain.
My days weren't so bad if and when I somehow managed to get a reasonable amount of sleep. However, at around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, my pain level would increase and the struggle would begin again. My life seemed to be nothing but chaos, an uncontrollable mess that I was not accustomed to. Pain and sleeplessness can make you go crazy. Once, I barely slept at all for 3 nights in a row. On the 4th day, I tried to make my way over to the viaduct. This is the day I describe in the first chapter. Of course, I am not proud of those moments, but for this book to be authentic, it must include the moments that I would rather forget as well. Later in this book, I will explain how I finally managed to overcome my pain without medication. Before the story continues though, I would like to quickly address the love-hate relationship I have with my stroke. I do hate what happened to me because it almost made me end it all, but I can accept and maybe even love the stroke because of all the new doors that hitting rock bottom opened for me. When gabapentin did not work at all for the pain reduction, I switched to amitriptyline. Amitriptyline is an antidepressant also used to help people with insomnia and neuropathic pain. It took another month for the pain to go down from a level 8 to a 5. Eventually, I took 3 20-milligram pills of amitriptyline a day and slept during the night. But I always started the day with a hazy feeling. I didn't like the idea of taking medication for an indefinite period of time, but level 5 pain wasn't something to settle for either. In the interim, taking that medication enabled me to regain a somewhat decent sleep schedule. The reduction in pain also meant that I could think straight again when my morning haze cleared. After switching from gabapentin to amitriptyline, I also stopped having suicidal thoughts. This was a direct result of being off the gabapentin. It all started to make sense after I read a leaflet on gabapentin. It states, "Can increase the potential for suicidal thoughts." According to Wikipedia's page on gabapentin, in 2009, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued a warning of an increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors in patients taking some anticonvulsant drugs, including gabapentin, modifying the packaging inserts to reflect this. A 2010 meta-analysis supported the increase of suicide associated with gabapentin use. I am sharing this information so you know that if you have experienced a stroke and developed neuropathic pain for where you need medication, you need to be aware of the possible effects of gabapentin. It almost certainly increased my suicidal thoughts because I started to see killing myself as a very plausible way to end my pain. Now that I had some sleep and a little energy back, I knew it was time for me to educate myself. No more destructive medication. I wanted to take charge of my life again. Chapter 12. Hero. As he handed me the small box of business cards, I smiled at him. "Just in case you got questions from someone you don't know," Remco said. "If you can't think of the right words to say, just give them one of these." I looked at the card on top. Its headline read, "My name is Linda, and I have aphasia." Beneath that, in smaller font, "I understand everything in English, Swedish, Dutch, and German, but finding the right words can be slower right now. This speech problem started in 2016 after a stroke. I am recovering." I was startled for a while. Seeing that on a card that belonged to me left me speechless. How ironic. Sometimes I believed that I was still in the middle of a bad dream. Remco gave the cards to me when we were in Stockholm, 6.5 months after my stroke. I was just out of my wheelchair. My Swedish family had arranged for me to go to a rehab station in Stockholm, Spinellis, for 2 weeks to receive intensive training there. While I was at the center, Remco and her children were going to travel around Canada. They deserved a break from all the stress and extra work that I had given them recently. Remco accompanied me to Stockholm and would fly back the next day. I had begun to read some of the books Remco had given me a few months earlier, including The Brain That Changes Itself and The Brain's Way of Healing, both written by Norman Deutsch. Back then, I couldn't make consistent progress in those books since my left eye only allowed me to read for 5 minutes before it fixated on the center of the page I was reading. The same center focus occurred when I was writing. Instead of starting in the upper left corner of a piece of paper, I would start writing in the middle of the paper. It took me 2 or 3 months to get over that. Only after that was my left eye able to start at the left side of the paper. Those 2 books really grabbed my attention, and I couldn't get enough of them. After reading them through once, I purchased the audiobooks. That allowed me to listen to them every day, since I didn't want to miss a single bit of what they contained. It was breathtaking information. It's hard to give an all-inclusive survey of Norman Deutsch's books, but I'll try to summarize what I found most important. Neuroplasticity. The word perfectly captures the amazing capabilities of our brain. Neuroplasticity is the brain's capacity to adapt, recover, and grow. Brain cells can, and will, take on new functions when required. The remaining part of the brain can also remodel its structure. This allows a new function to replace the old one. Lost functions can, therefore, re-establish themselves elsewhere in the brain. In short, this is why you can regain lost function, and why it is nonsense that this recovery process is limited to a certain amount of time. If this is true, why did they tell me that my recovery would last no longer than 6 months? I researched this subject on Google, YouTube, in audiobooks, printed books, and published articles on the topic of neuroplasticity. Here's a small part of what I discovered. We have understood neuroplasticity for about 50 years, but professionals have only begun to make full use of its potential in the last 10 to 20 years. It has only been possible to scan the brain at different moments in time since MRI scanners became more widely available in the past 2 decades. Doing research with the MRI confirmed what had already been stated by the pioneers on neuroplasticity for many years beforehand. Scientists like Edward Taub, Michael Merzenich, and Paul Bacchi-Rita showed that the concept of neuroplasticity is beneficial when dealing with a stroke or brain injury, regardless of its extent. They did so decades before the functional MRI found its full way into research. After a stroke or other serious brain injury, when the brain is left with a damaged area, the surviving neurons and healthy cells at the border of the affected areas can start to take over the role of their deceased neighbors. This can be achieved by stimulating the brain to perform the lost tasks. As you might know, all cells in our body carry our entire DNA. Each of your cells holds the complete blueprint of your body. Our nerve cells are no exception, and they are therefore programmable to perform any function. Both its location and the influence of neighboring cells end up deciding a cell's function. If the need to take on a different function arises, the cell can do so because the required DNA is already present in its center, the cell nucleus. Specificity is the key. The capacity of the brain to heal itself does come with a catch though. To regain a function, the brain parts that need to be repaired or reorganized have to be stimulated very precisely and with the right intensity. What this means for you is that you'll have to use what is not functioning, even if that seems impossible at first. Moreover, it will take a lot of work before you start seeing small improvements. Significant improvement won't be achieved in either days or a few months, but can take several years. Lots of patience and a large amount of determination are critical to your recovery. I thought about this for a while. Determination and patience. Determination, that I had for sure. Patience, not so much. But while researching patience, I came to the conclusion that I had to concentrate on small wins. A combination of these incremental victories lead to larger and greater accomplishments. I was now hooked on the subject of neuroplasticity, hence the subtitle of this book. As I realized it was my get out of post-stroke jail free card, I decided to spend every afternoon looking up more information. Neuroplasticity. I was going to cling on to those words, neuro, nervous system, and plasticity, the quality of being easily shaped or molded, like it was a matter of life or death. In fact, my life did depend on it. I had begun to feel like my brain's unlimited ability to improve was providing me with a much-needed motivation to fight for my recovery. I knew it was not going to be easy, and a lot of hard work lay ahead. I knew all of that, but I still started to see myself as a guinea pig in my own study on neuroplasticity. Even though I had no idea how to proceed, I was going to give it my best shot. All I knew at that point was one simple fact. I was going to do my best to succeed. The brain's way of healing also had an interesting section on chronic pain. A doctor named Michael Moskowitz had reprogrammed his brain to no longer feel the chronic pain that he had been suffering from for 13 years. I needed to look into that. I realized that pain might become the biggest enemy of my recovery. Remco flew home to take his trip to Canada with our 3 children. I was not going to see them for over 2 weeks, which was entirely new to me. I was going to stay in Kungsholmen, a pleasant area in Stockholm, with my brother Urban and his lovely wife Monica. Urban is a Swedish Royal Navy commander and a dentist. I felt safe and welcome in their large apartment. Monica gave me massages when I was in pain, and all of my brothers and sisters took shifts taking me to and from the rehab station just outside Stockholm. I met a lot of friendly and encouraging people at the rehab station. Many of the physical therapists who worked there had experienced accidents themselves and were in wheelchairs. That aspect created a special bond between therapists and their patients. One example was Danny, the gym instructor. He was able to stand up and walk for a bit, but he could not walk steadily yet. He shared his story with me one day. He had fallen from scaffolding at a construction site, and the fall had left him with a spine injury. One evening, Monica asked me, "Do you want to see a documentary about the founder of Spinalis?" "Yes," I replied. The documentary on Claes Hultling was more than inspiring. He had done the extraordinary. Claes Hultling was an anesthesiologist at Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm. In 1984, 3 weeks before his wedding, he was on an island in the archipelago of Stockholm when he drove into shallow water and broke his neck. He became paralyzed from his chest down. After an initial mental breakdown, he convinced himself that the show must go on, so to speak. He refused to see himself as a victim. He also made it his mission to aid and support people with spinal cord injuries. A few weeks after his accident, he did indeed get married, in the hospital, with 100 guests. He also convinced the hospital's emergency helicopter pilots to fly him out to his summer house in Landsort for the weekend to celebrate his honeymoon. From the outset, he was a rebel who saw opportunities instead of obstacles. Along with his friend Richard Levi, a neurologist and colleague, Claes went to the US and Australia. They wanted to learn how to work with and take care of people with spinal cord injuries. When they returned to Sweden, they possess more than enough motivation and information to start their own spinal cord injury unit. They managed to get funding from the private sector with the assistance of Hans Norbert, an ice hockey player who had broken his neck. With the Ice Hockey World Cup, a fundraiser was launched. Corporate Sweden followed up with donations. In the following decades, Spinalis became the Swedish authority on research and treatment of spinal cord injury victims. In 2010, Spinalis helped set up a similar spinal cord facility in Botswana. After watching the video, I couldn't put the documentary out of my head for several weeks. Claes Holtling had set an example for me. He was my new hero.